Counter-Terrorism Today.
Hello and welcome to 106.2 FM IDC International Radio. I'm Itai Hanman and this is Counter-Terrorism Today, and we have a very special episode for everybody today. It's a very interesting one. We're delving into the International Cyber Terrorism Regulation Project. We have Advocate Deborah Housen-Couriel with us in studio today. She joined us last week in our joint roundtable discussion with Dr. Saltman and Dr. Gano, and we had a very interesting, enlightening discussion, and we're going to delve into it a little bit further today with Advocate Housen here, and we're going to have a very interesting conversation on the project itself and the broader implications that that the project is going to have an effect on. Let's give our listeners and viewers potentially a little bit of background on the project itself. So what is the International Cyber Terrorism Regulation Project?
Happy to be here, first of all, and discuss it a little bit more in depth.
Thank you so much.
It's a great opportunity, and always a pleasure here. So our project, as we discussed a little bit last week, is really, we think, one of the first of its kind to really map out as widely as we can all types of regulation that encounter terrorist use of the internet, misuse of the internet, if you will. And we want to know how regulators, countries, or international organizations, and even private companies are dealing with this real threat in all of its manifestations. We'll go into a little bit of detail further on, but how are we doing this? What are the best practices, and what are the trends looking like?
And so in this step of the project, I know that there will be a policy report that is going to be written for it. But in this first stage, it's a website. And the website will be coming online in just a couple of weeks.
Correct.
And maybe you can tell us, what do you find as the greatest purpose to the website itself? Because the policy paper is going to be very interesting, filled with all of the relevant information, and can be published and spread out in a variety of platforms and sent to academics and practitioners around the world. But a website is sort of, on the other end, a place where you can put all your information, but you need to draw the crowd to it.
Exactly.
So what do you see coming out of this website?
Well, first of all, you've described it really well. First of all, we have kind of an interesting situation in that the website is it's being the change, if you will. In other words, we're using a website to really focus attention on the issue of how terrorists and their allies use internet websites and other pieces of cyberspace, and we can talk about in a second what those other pieces might be. So we're speaking the same language, if you will. The point of the website is to create a one-stop shop for those who are studying counterterrorism in cyberspace, those who are practitioners, potential regulators, companies who are interested in looking at how they might do a better job of curbing problematic terrorist content. We want everything to be in one place, and the website gives us a huge advantage because it allows for real facility of use, agility. We can change content as it develops over time. It's a very rapidly growing field. So our hope is that rather than stay in a traditional context of a policy paper, we'll have a much more dynamic, up-to-date tool for practitioners and researchers to use.
Are we at a critical junction right now in the war on terror and the use of the cyber world?
That's a great question. I think we're approaching a tipping point. And it's possible to posit that we've been approaching a tipping point for a long time now. The reason I think that we are approaching a different kind of a change is that countries especially are really starting to understand the costs morally, politically, socially, beyond the financial costs of hostile activity on the internet in general. And that lesson is, I think, really hitting home. Unfortunately, it's responses that are needed to malicious activities. We'd much rather have a situation where those malicious activities were not taking place. But I agree. I do think that we're approaching a tipping point. Let me, if I may, make a really important distinction right off the bat before we get into more of the detail on this. So we're really careful to distinguish in the work that we're doing, both on the website and in the policy paper, between two types of terrorist activity on the internet and through cyberspace. Cyberspace is broader than the internet. The internet is one type of use of cyberspace, but for example, the use of mobile telephones, the use of GPS, are other examples of how cyberspace is used that are not internet examples. Terrorist use of the internet, on the one hand, includes things like terrorist propaganda over the internet, recruitment, raising of money, that are all part of the terrorist, if you will, ecosystem. So certainly terrorist use of the internet is illegal and is addressed by regulation. And on the other hand, we have a world that we have not quite entered into yet, which is a good thing, and that is the leverage of cyberspace and cyberspace in general and the internet in particular to actually cause physical harm in the world.
Like hacking.
Even more than that. For example, if we can bring it right up to the border of what the virtual and where the virtual and physical borderline is. So, for example, these are unfortunate examples, but we need to use them. So, a terrorist group that would direct the activities of someone who is about to commit a terrorist act through an earpiece, through using GPS, through using messaging up until the actual terrorist act in the physical space. That would be terrorist use of the internet. But leveraging cyberspace, internet, and other types of use of cyberspace to take out an electrical system, to intervene in pacemakers.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Am I too far, or is my imagination running around too much when I read all the books on the Mossad or read the books on the CIA, and I love all my spy novels and all of that wonderful world that I immerse myself into. But recently, in some of the reports and readings and documentaries I've watched on the Stuxnet virus that allegedly Israel and the United States collaborated on to harm the Iranian nuclear reactors, part of what they did, supposedly, was infiltrate a technology company and were able to manipulate some of the physical hardware to do what they needed it to do. Now, again, this is not so much my imagination as I was able to read this upon the Stuxnet virus operation. Is that something that we need to fear that terrorists are going to be able to do, is infiltrate technology companies and physically alter some of their programs?
Big question. Scary question. Even distinguishing between nation-state activities and terrorist activities, and that's a whole discussion that we're going to get into on our website in our policy paper. I think the fact is that Stuxnet is old news. I think we're only seeing the very, very beginning of this tsunami of how we all use the internet for good, and how bad actors use the internet and the rest of cyberspace for evil, so that, for example, we have, and science fiction of today is the news headlines of tomorrow, correct? So I think we're in that corner of the spectrum of the unknown unknowns. We don't quite know yet what the worst possible news is. We may not want to know it. Countered, of course, by good things, but I guess where I would place our project in the context of your question is that we're really trying to do our best to map out how governance of the internet and governance of cyberspace can anticipate, close gaps, do the best, make the best possible effort in order to encounter both terrorist use of the internet and eventually, we haven't quite seen this yet, but eventual physical impacts, so that we have a toolbox that can at least work at the preventive level. And the idea is to get those tools spread around and as well known as possible, so that many, many actors on the good side of the spectrum can use them.
You're listening to 106.2 FM IDC International Radio. This is Counter-Terrorism today, and we have a special guest with us, Advocate Deborah Housen-Couriel, Research Associate and Adjunct Professor at the ICT, and a Fellow Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center at Tel Aviv University. This is a counterterrorism program, so gonna delve slightly into the counterterrorism aspect of things. And you made mention of a couple of ways that terrorists have been able to pervert the internet to their use, to what they're looking for. Maybe you can lay out a couple more examples of how they are perverting the internet to what they are looking for, and what are some of the necessary steps needed to be taken to combat that perversion.
Sure. So I would instead of using the word perversion, I would call it misuse.
Okay.
Misuse of the internet, and it's really leveraging the incredible power that the internet and the rest of cyberspace gives to any one of us as an individual and gives to groups. Number one on our list would be propaganda. I mean, we were all several years back really shocked to see sort of unrestricted, at the time, unrestricted propaganda that included very shocking pictures that really moved terrorist ideology forward. And we were all familiar with them. And even I remember clicking on a few, videos that I shouldn't have clicked on, the content that shouldn't have been out there, shouldn't have been public. So that's one example. So used for propaganda, for getting an ideological message out in very shocking ways. That's part of the plan. A little bit more behind the scenes, is something that we're all very aware of here at the ICT, is the whole issue of financing of terrorism. And for that, the internet is used, the dark web is used. It's an excellent way to get funds transferred. Again, we all now sort of live in the world where financial transactions have become much more frictionless. I can do a bank transfer fairly easily. It doesn't cost a lot of money. I think in my bank it's a shekel and 20 agorot to make a bank transfer. So massive transfers of funds can be done fairly easily over the internet. Terrorists also use that capability with all the obviously the anonymity that the internet permits. So those are two examples. More complex examples include really recruitment over the long term of young people in the West, around the world, who may have an ideological interest or may have some sort of interest in the terrorist ideology in the abstract. Identification on the part of terrorist groups of those sort of ripe young individuals and bringing them into the loop of recruitment is something that the internet is absolutely fitted for. We also we have now 2 or 3 generations that are digital natives. That's the language they speak. That's the way to get to them. That's the way to influence them, if you will.
I think it's a really interesting debate to have about the internet as a whole. When you look at the internet and its invention, when it was out there, it was brought in for information sharing via universities to, really at the beginning, academic sharing of information, a platform where someone in the United States could speak to someone in Oxford in the UK and collaborate on a project without having to worry about old systems. Advancements, the military took on a broadband of its own in the United States, obviously in the early years, and as it advanced and the personal computer started to come into the homes in the 1990s, the internet flourished, and you had the dial-up internet and later DSL and cable and all the fiber optics that we have now, and can't even get into the types of...
We're on a curve.
Exactly.
We're on a curve.
It's going and going.
Sure.
But one thing that I think that in 2018 specifically is coming to a head is the lack or the loss of what could be looked at as the Wild West frontier. The internet in that sense was a Wild West frontier. Mm-hmm. There was no regulations. You could post whatever you wanted on the content. Information was being shared, good, bad, the ugly. It didn't matter. It was on the internet. You had companies transition themselves. The dot-com bust and boom of the late 90s, early 2000s are proof of how companies saw the use and the need for the internet. As we advanced, social media came into prominence. But one thing that is now really coming to a head, government versus internet advocates. And I'm not trying to take one side or the other here. I'm trying to understand, are we as a people who love this tool, the internet, losing our freedoms to regulations and companies that now really control the internet as a whole? It's not anymore the Wild West. It's like California's been tamed. That's it. The gold rush is over, and now the taming and government is coming into place, and regulations are being put into place. And not saying they're not necessary, not saying they are necessary. I want to get your...
Sure. This is the question of our time. I really strongly believe that we have, on the one hand, and again, the we is a problematic. Also, it's really important to give this. This is a great kind of end of 2018 news flash, is that the latest statistics out on internet connectivity show us that more than half of humanity is presently connected to the internet.
Wow.
And that can be, I think it's measured in terms of who has over the last 3 months made a connection like that. But that is an incredibly quick, you've described some of it, really quick rise through this whole new human reality, for good and also for bad. So we're in a whole new reality. And we need to be really careful, I think, and this is in terms of the regulation, what we're referring to when we talk about the we. Who is the we here? And so we have the full understanding that the internet is a global resource, and a global governance regime is really important on the one hand. On the other hand, countries regulate historically on a territorial basis. So issues of jurisdiction, which is a lawyer word, but really means what force do the regulations have in terms of the territory over which they have an effect and the people over which they have an effect. How do we translate that? Even if we want to pick up this tool, sharpen it, and use it, how do we take care of the enforcement piece? And that goes into your point about the Wild West, is I think you were going to the fact that there was really no sense that governance is necessary. There was law. Law's always there. We may not always know it's there. We may not always pay attention to it, but it's always there. So we do have, on the one hand, a need for law and regulation on the part of countries to move into this new space. In this project, in the ICTRP, we're really taking a look at how countries are doing that. And we're dividing them into 3 different categories. At this point, we may get further in our research, but we have countries who have taken their old or traditional, let's say, criminal law and said, yeah, we're going to make a few tweaks here and there, but the criminal law that we have in the past for bad types of speech, for example, terrorist content, we're going to move it over to cyberspace, and we pretty much can do that with the law that we have, with a few tweaks. We have other countries who've cyberized their laws and who say, yeah, we're aware that we need to undertake this challenge of hostile activity in cyberspace over the internet. We're going to do it with a whole new law. And then there are countries who are somewhere in the middle. Israel, for example, has taken a really, interesting strategic approach and said, we're going to look at the end result of the activity, whether it's physical or whether it happens in cyberspace, and we're going to then make the call on whether we have illegal activity. However the activity happens, we're going to look at the final results. So, for example, if a critical information system is taken down, if the electoral system is taken down, God forbid, if that'll never happen, if the water supply is taken out of commission through cyberspace, or physically, we're just going to look at the end result and make the call in terms of the legality of it. So there are different paths that regulators take when they're countries on how to encounter these challenges. And we're trying to map all of these out and kind of identify where the best practices are. One more piece on that, if I may. We have to be really careful with the methodology here, because a lot of what I've just described deals with criminal activity on the internet, not necessarily terrorist activity. And we have to be really careful that there's a line there. And not all countries have an appropriate definition of terrorist activities on the internet.
In our previous discussions, you've brought up, and just now as well, the regulatory models that we were discussing. So what type of models were chosen for the project, and how were they chosen?
Okay, great question, and a tough question. We've we tried to get in this initial stage. We tried to get a representative basis of mostly Western democratic regimes. In fact, I think exclusively Western democratic regimes, just to put that mapping out as a first step. So we're looking at Germany, we're looking at France, we're looking at the UK, we're looking at the US, we're looking at Israel, and that'll be the group of countries that we look at, that we're looking at first and that we've mapped out. Really interesting and sort of ironic to note that these strong democratic regimes have been quite forthright, I would say, in their regulation of terrorism in general and cyber terrorism specifically in general. And the second group of regulators, if you will, that we're looking at are international organizations. This is a category that some might say has nothing to do with regulation because international organizations don't strictly regulate, but it's important to set that out. We're looking at a very broad view of what regulation is. So laws, policies, strategies, we're taking them all into account. So for example, the UN has done a lot of work on hostile use of the internet by terrorists. We're taking that into account and mapping it out. We're looking at NATO, we're looking at the EU, we're looking at the OSCE. So that's our second group. And then the third group, which is going to be our most controversial, and we've got to have a little bit of controversy, otherwise we're not doing real research, and that is to take a look very carefully at what private sector companies are doing. So our social media companies, several of them, and we're not going to name names, but several of them have taken upon themselves, if you will, self-regulation about the kind of terrorist content that they're going to take down. Now, that's a really interesting piece of the action. Sure.
Do these companies come up with their policies on their own or in conjunction, with other companies, with other jurisdictions, trying to format it to the laws of the land where they're operating? Or is it based on where they're headquartered? So let's just take an example of one of the big tech companies that's headquartered out of Silicon Valley. Are they forced to follow U.S. law specifically when it comes to removing content? Or if the content was uploaded in the Czech Republic, are they using Czech Republic law to remove the content?
So it depends. It depends. And this is one of the more complex issues that we have in cyberspace is the whole issue of jurisdiction. This sounds like a lawyerly evasion of an answer. It's not. It's a very complex issue. And if any types of actors in cyberspace and on the internet are aware of this complexity, it's these private sector companies. So it really depends. It depends what the policies are. It depends in what context. In the news a lot, we're seeing of how different countries, China, for example, has different requirements of these companies than other maybe Western countries might have. And I'm not going to get into the detail on that because it can get pretty thorny and it's all, again, very controversial. We're mapping it out and we're going to see how it works. But I think the real question that is sort of the meta question, if you will, is how we're starting to think about private sector companies who have a global reach as regulators. Right? So on the one hand, sure, a local government, the US government, the UK government, the Israeli government can go to a court, get an order and ask for, and demand that content be removed because it violates local laws. That's one track. And that's part of the country regulation. But we have this relatively new separate track where companies are saying, even before the court order comes in,
regulate themselves.
I'm going to self-regulate, or we're going to self-regulate, and we're going to put a policy on our site and be absolutely transparent, or be as transparent, be relatively transparent with our users and say, this is content that we're going to remove. Some of them even say, dear users, help us identify this content, and have a red button to push where you can identify content that's problematic as a user. I think the meta question here is what role are we allowing private companies to fulfill when they carry out really kind of a regulatory activity? What's the supervision over their regulatory activity? What's their real interest? Partially, of course, it's to get bad content off of their websites. But I think we need to be really careful with these directions, as we need to be careful with the directions that countries are going as well. We have in the back of our minds, all of us who look at these laws, the very difficult issue of government surveillance of our activities on the internet. So there's a behind-the-scenes very strong connection between governments, between these social media companies, an important exchange of information regarding prevention of terrorist use of the internet, and what else?
In one of Dr. Ganor's books, he maps out the democratic dilemma. And that's something you just touched on right now, is who is regulating and what type of regulation can be put into place. And we have seen that the international community has not been able to come together to create a globalized, agreed-upon definition of terrorism as a whole. So when private companies are taking it upon themselves to define what they believe to be terrorist content or terrorism and put it in their user protocols, if you will, what does the outside governing community look at that and say, well, if companies can come up with a definition, how come the global community can't come up with a definition? And when you don't have that definition, that's where you come into the problems of one country surveying no problem, another country says, no, you can't survey this, or one country says, no, that's not terrorist propaganda, that's freedom fighters hooray video, if you will, right? And then you have freedom of speech issues and censorship. And how important is finding a definition then that the global community can agree upon, that this is cyber terrorism, not necessarily terrorism for the rest of the world, but cyber terrorism because we're dealing with the perversion of the internet or the misuse of the internet.
Exactly. So lawyers love definitions. They are our tools. That's what we knew. We need them. And we do the best job that we can through laws, through other types of regulation in getting at these definitions. As everyone who is in any way associated with the ICT knows, one of the big challenges of our effort to counter or to engage in counterterrorism is to really know, as you said, to really know what we're engaging with, what types of activities. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, it's really important for us to remember as regulators, as lawyers, that the enforcement piece is critical here, because we can even have very elegant definitions. We can have them down to the finest wordsmithing possible. If we don't have the enforcement piece, then we've really not moved the needle on this at all. So I think the answer would be somewhere in the middle. We need to have a definition that's a working definition, in the sense that it's on the books, whether it's the country's law books or whether it's the private internet providers or internet companies' policies. It's always going to be a work in progress. That's what laws are, works in progress. But I would move the discussion, again, and that's what we're mapping out. So that's critical. I think one of the next stages of this research is going to need to focus on how we take what we've mapped out, once we get our policy paper in place, and get responses from, no one has a monopoly on the truth on this. We need to hear from others and see what the inputs are as far as whether the directions we think we ought to go in are correct. And once we have that sense of, we're moving in the right direction in terms of regulation of this space and preventing or setting up our laws and our regulations and our internet policies, for that matter, in a way that's going to support the struggle or the counterterrorism initiative. I think the next stage will then be, okay, so what are the best ways to enforce these norms that we've been able to put on the books, and what look like to be the best practices? Because that enforcement piece is critical. It's global. A lot of it is happening already. There's a lot of cooperation going on among law enforcement entities around hostile use of the internet by terrorists. Money laundering is a great example. There's a whole mechanism in place that we're looking at as well. But that's sort of if we're doing the front end and the back end, both of them are needed. So right now we're focusing on the front end, what the regulation looks like, what those definitions look like, who's doing and I'm saying who's not so much who's doing a better job, but what definitions are more appropriate and more helpful. Once we have all those pieces in play and have that kind of puzzle worked out, then we want to move on to how the enforcement works and how to do that best.
We have time for just two more quick questions, and we'll look to the future for both of these questions. I wanted to ask you, on a technological front, as we spoke about the internet, the Wild West as it was, and it's being tamed now, and technology continues to advance. The next stage in technology and computing is really an amalgamation of internet and technology, and that is being seen in the artificial intelligence and the big data collection, specifically quantum computing. Where do you see that going? In what direction does that go in helping combat terrorism as a whole vis-a-vis the internet?
The wide open use of the internet by the rest of us, I think you mean. It's going in both directions, and that's what's so compelling about this whole issue, that on the one hand, the use of big data, algorithms, and surveillance, for that matter, of activity on the internet is a very powerful tool in the hands of governments who want to engage with counterterrorism, and it certainly boosts their capabilities. There's no arguing with that. That conclusion bumps up against the fact that we, as citizens of democratic countries, need to be very, very concerned about how our governments use those capabilities. Certainly, there are priorities for national security and global security that need to be addressed. We all want that to happen. On the other hand, we don't know we don't see a bright line between the government mass surveillance, use of big data, and the protection of our democratic rights, our freedom of speech, the whole issue of the chilling effect that once we know we're being surveyed, how are we self-censoring? How are we for example, not going into
consciously changing our
sites.
Behaviors?
Yeah, even on our research team when we were doing this research. Do we have full license to go into terrorist sites to see what kind of propaganda they're putting on the sites? Or should we refrain from that? Even at that very basic level of what do we research and what do we not research, there's kind of a chilling effect of, well, maybe someone's looking over my shoulder. And that's a real problem. I mean, and obviously beyond the academic world, real issues of people who have unpopular things to say and want to say them and insist on saying them, and may be dancing on a very thin line in terms of inviting government surveillance. So we don't know yet. And part of the challenge in the counterterrorism context is to figure out how we do this best, and sort of looking at a curve that's going to allow us to, on the one hand, protect national security, protect global security in the counterterrorism context, but still make sure that we're keeping human rights as intact as possible. Not an easy job.
Humans are explorers by the nature of things, and we're exploring now the cyber world into depths we've never even could have imagined 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. Before we let you go, want to ask you one final question, more specific to the project. The International Counterterrorism Regulation Project is, as we mentioned, going to be releasing its online content in the sense of a website in a few weeks. The policy paper report will come out in the not too distant future. Where do you see the evolution of this project after these two stages have been completed? Where do you see the project moving forward after that?
I think our hope is that our hope is a double hope, and this depends on how things move ahead in terms of response to the project and how well received it is. We're going to do our best to move into the next stage, which would be certainly broadening the number of governments and of countries that we're going to be reviewing, so that we have a much broader scope of regimes, not only Western democratic ones, but countries of all different stripes and all different kinds of legal regimes. Because as we know, the internet is a global resource, and no regulator can afford just to look at his or her own sort of small area. We have to look at a very diverse set of regimes. So that would be one thing. And again, I think that the enforcement piece is really important. And again, a lot of the enforcement takes place behind the scenes, and that's absolutely fine. Mapping that out to the extent that it can be mapped out is, I think, critical to moving ahead and to getting a whole picture of how we can really move the needle on the counterterrorism efforts in cyberspace.
This has been a very informative, enlightening discussion with Advocate Deborah Housen-Couriel, Research Associate and Adjunct Professor at the ICT IDC Herzliya, and a Fellow, Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center, Tel Aviv University. The International Cyber Terrorism Regulation Project, a special episode here on Counterterrorism today. Thank you so much for joining us and
thank you.
Involving us in this wonderful, wonderful project that you are conducting.
Real pleasure. Thank you, and we'll keep you posted.
Yes, please, and thank you. This has been Counterterrorism today on 106.2 FM IDC International Radio. Thank you to our guest, Advocate Deborah Housen-Couriel, and thank you to our production team and everyone listening and viewing.
Thank you.
Counterterrorism today.